All right. Thank you. All set.
dear friends, Representative Sherrill, and Representative Raskin. My name is Bob Conley. I have the pleasure of serving as the mayor of Borough of Madison, proudly known as the Rose City. And I am delighted to have you all visit our historic Hockey Dodge Memorial, which I will lay claim to being the most beautiful one town hall in New Jersey, if not the country, so it's also otherwise. Before I do some acknowledgments, I just want to point out, hanging behind our representatives is Geraldine Rockefeller Dodge. And this building was a gift from her to Madison. And as part of the deal, she said, I want my picture hanging in the chambers. So that I'll be behind the mayor, looking over the council to ensure the utmost decorum and respect is maintained at all times, which is certainly an appropriate message for today. So, thank you, Geraldine. So, I'm going to start with a very special acknowledgement. This Sicknick family joined us this morning. As we know, U.S. Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick lost his life in the line of duty from injuries sustained while protecting our Capitol on January 6th. He is a true hero, and it's an honor to have you all here today. And recognize some of our special guests here today. Right in front of me, State Senator Brittany Kimberly. We have a representative of Assemblywoman Dunn's office, Michael Polito. Morris County Prosecutor Bob Carroll from the Morris County Prosecutor's Office. And the Morris County First Assistant Prosecutor Maggie Hollywood. Essex County Commissioner Bennett Gill. Passaic County Clerk Danielle Marilyn Imhoff. From Madison, our Council President Eric Range. Deputy Mayor Michael Troy. Morris Township Mayor Donna Wadlinga. Randolph Mayor Christine Carey. Former Randolph Mayor Roman Herniak, who is also with the Ukrainian American Cultural Center of New Jersey. Livingston Councilman Kenton Utani. Harden Councilman and Harden Dodge Trustee Nick Platt. Harden Township Committee Member Amalia Duarte. We also have several college and university presidents and leaders with us this morning. Centered right here in Madison, Dr. Hillary Link, Drew University. Almost in Madison, Dr. Barry Crosby, President of St. Elizabeth University. Dr. Tony Iacono, President of County College of Morris. Chief Strategy Officer for Philly Tickets, even has a little bit of Madison. Representative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. I really appreciate you being here today for this important discussion, and I do just want to recognize once again the family of Officer Sidnick. I feel personally that I wouldn't be here today without his protection. It's really a treat to be here today with one of my colleagues who I so deeply respect. Not only is he truly one of the thought leaders in our caucus, his knowledge of our nation's history and our Constitution is really breathtaking to me, but he's also a kind and compassionate and thoughtful leader, so it really is truly an honor to have him here with me today, Mr. Jamie Raskin. You don't always get like cat calls and it's obviously not just me who holds it. Jamie represents Maryland's 8th congressional district, which borders Washington, D.C. to the north, and currently serves as the ranking member on the House Oversight Committee. So Jamie takes the tough jobs. I serve in the House Armed Services Committee, the Committee on Strategic Competition with the Chinese Communist Party. These are sort of bipartisan, known for their bipartisanship and working to get to consensus on how we handle our nation's security. The Oversight Committee is not necessarily known for bipartisanship, and Jamie might tell you about a few of the members that sit on that committee. That is a pretty hardcore committee where we really need someone like Jamie in leadership to be able to eloquently advocate for this country and our responsibilities as members of the House of Representatives. You may recognize him for several of the really key roles he's taken on as the second impeachment trial manager and a key member of the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. He's a constitutional law professor. He served in the Maryland State Senate for 3 terms. I mean, he's just really got quite the resume. But what I really am thrilled to have worked with Jamie on is the Democracy Summer Project, where he really helps students across the nation get involved in our democracy. And they have Zooms and education, and it's really been amazing to take part in that. So I'm so happy to have him here today so we can have a discussion about our Constitution and some of what's been going on in our nation from someone who's really been on the front lines of so much of it. So during the Trump presidency, it became apparent that administration was going to push the limits and go even beyond some of the limits of presidential power and the executive branch actions, testing our system of checks and balances and creating some unprecedented situations. So whether it was the so-called Muslim travel ban or demanding a quid pro quo from our Democratic allies, or fighting the director of the FBI for not slowing down investigations, it was sometimes hard to keep track of all of the different areas that we were seeing this push. And in the years since, there have been fewer of these constitutional challenges in this administration, but I think where we still see some real concerns right now is the Supreme Court. So we're seeing extensive reporting that shows Justice Thomas has improperly and unethically accepted expensive gifts from a well-connected billionaire. And now Justice Alito has flown flags that align himself with the Stop the Steal campaign, right-wing Christian nationalism. You and I both signed letters calling on him to recuse himself from the ongoing January 6th and Trump-related cases. So what more can be done as we are going through these tumultuous times to create a sense of trust in our court system, because historically that was the one impartial branch that we all relied on to stand in the breach. So how do we now think of it going forward? I started with an easy question again.
Well, can I dodge the question for 1 second? Just thank you, Mikie, for having me, and thank the beautiful people of New Jersey for sending Mikie Sherrill to Congress. I also want to say hi to my friends in the Sicknick family. We remember Gary all the time, and we praise you not just for having produced that magnificent patriot, but also for everything you continue to do to demand that the law be enforced in America for everybody equally. So thank you. So I guess I want to say two things about this, Mikie. One is about the specific case. You asked what can be done. And it so happens I stayed up last night I wasn't in Morristown, I was in Passaic. Yeah, I was in Bergen. This is my 20th state, so I'm getting a little confused where I am. But it was beautiful, and we were with Billy Pascal, who's a great member also. And I think he's the senior member of our caucus. He's 87 years old. So he could run for president. So what I want to say is, first of all, because I stayed up and writing this op-ed about your question, because it's been bugging me, and everybody's beating their breasts about how there's nothing we can do because the highest court in the land has the lowest ethical standards in the land, which is that there is no binding ethics code and there is no binding ethics process. So, if you have a problem with a state judge in Jersey or a federal district judge, there's actually a process for complaining, and they can oversee it. For the Supreme Court, it's a law unto itself, so it violates that first Madisonian principle, which is that no one should be a judge in his or her own case, right? But I started to think, this is not just an ethics problem, it's a constitutional problem, because the Supreme Court itself has struck down a number of legal judgments and verdicts based on a biased judge, saying that it violates due process. So it's a constitutional problem, and there's something that can be done. It's called a writ of mandamus, and you might remember that from Marbury versus Madison, where Marbury went. I'm sure somebody in this building had something to do with it. But the writ of mandamus is just a mandate. You go to the Supreme Court and you say, order somebody to comply with the law. And it's not happened before, but why couldn't the other 7 justices issue a writ of mandamus to Justices Alito and Thomas to do the right thing and recuse themselves from the case? So anyway, I wrote a little piece about that. It's coming to a newspaper published in a neighboring state, and you guys will be able to read it hopefully later tonight or tomorrow. But I basically take Chief Justice Roberts at his word. He says that a judge is just an umpire, right? Well, would Major League Baseball allow an umpire to officiate at the World Series if he was flying the pennant, the flag of one of the teams in his yard, or flying one of the flags of the other teams upside down, or if his wife was protesting to the league that the last game's score should be nullified and reversed? I don't think so. So let's take it seriously. If a judge is going to be like an umpire, then act like an umpire and look at what the ethics rules are for umpires in the country. I mean, we're going to have to deal with the problem of a very lopsided and gerrymandered Supreme Court, is the truth. Now, my constituent is in Maryland's 8th District, is Merrick Garland, who's now, of course, the Attorney General, but he was nominated to the bench in February 2016 by President Obama. And Merrick Garland had been the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit for decades, perhaps the most qualified person nominated to the Supreme Court in our lifetime in terms of his judicial experience. It was remarkable. And Senator McConnell said that he would not be allowed even a hearing because 10 months was too close to the next election. And he said he wanted the people to decide. Of course, President Obama was elected to one of those true blue, verifiable, bona fide 4-year terms in office, and he was empowered to nominate Merrick Garland, and he should have gotten a hearing. Well, then you may recall 4 years later, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg of saint in memory died in October of 2020, or late September of 2020, just 2.5 months before the election. And then immediately Senator McConnell was asked, well, you're not going to have hearings to fill the seat before the election, 2.5 months before the election. And he said, well, of course we will. And he laughed about it, and it was a big joke. So, that's a serious problem from my perspective. And they went ahead and barreled through the nomination of Mrs. Waterford. But anyway, I guess what I'm saying is, we've got to think seriously about where the court is. And, here's one modest little proposal for people to think about if and when we get there. We have 13 federal circuits in America. We only have 9 justices right now. 5 of those justices come from New York City, right? And I love visiting New York like everybody else. But we've got 1 Supreme Court justice for each borough. Okay? That's not fair. How about 1 justice from each federal circuit in America? Each president gets to nominate 2 18-year terms. We can honor life tenure.
New Jersey hasn't really done very well of their Supreme Court Justice, so
Yes.
we may be careful in this state, in this circuit. But something else that I think has upset me about the controversy over the flags is the appeal to heaven flag, because I've seen a growing Christian nationalism, and really even our current speaker, as he was giving his speech, spoke a lot about religion, even pointing to the "In God We Trust" that was in the House of Representatives. And I feel very threatened by that, because to me it feels as if somebody is dictating to me what my belief system should be. And from the far right of Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism seems to come out a lot of attacks on, quite frankly, women and women's rights. So I think that's an extra level of threat to me personally. And so, as we're seeing that appeal to heaven flag that Justice Alito was flying, as we're hearing, I think as well as anybody, some of how that was brought back, and Reverend Sheets and his belief system that I think he said there's no gate that has allowed more evil to enter our nation than that of the Supreme Court, and specifically talking about rulings related to same-sex marriage and abortion. How, again, as we're looking at some of religion being what feels like injected into our system of government, how do we look at that? How do we fight back about that? I guess, too, I'm thinking of you recently, impressed me with your off-the-cuff knowledge of our Pledge of Allegiance when there was a discussion on the floor of the House about the Pledge of Allegiance and the statement "under God," and then our founding fathers, and sort of a revisionist history of how deeply religious our founding fathers were. How do we sort of combat some of this vision when we're a system of government that I think, has protected people, in fact, members of my own family historically fleeing religious persecution to the nation that was supposed to protect all forms of religion?
Yeah. Well, now you've happened onto one of my favorite subjects, which is, what really was the miracle of our revolution and the Declaration and the U.S. Constitution. And certainly the idea of government of the people against the kings, the monarchs, the czars, the emperors and empresses, and so on. The form of separation of powers we've got, but you could make a very strong argument that the real genius of the American Constitution was that it was the first time in the history of humanity when people were able to organize a government that separated church and state for the first time, because every other government had merged them together and there were official churches. So our founders were Enlightenment liberals who rebelled against centuries of religious crusades, holy wars between the Catholics and the Protestants that were every bit as vicious as the wars between the Shia and the Sunni today, Inquisition, witchcraft trials, and so on. And they wanted to put that in the rearview mirror of history and say, we can leave to each person as a matter of conscience how he or she wants to worship and not get the government and the state involved. And that is something that America still has to teach the rest of the world. That's one of the real glories of the American experiment. And yet, we deal with this, on a daily or weekly basis in Congress. I just told the story at another event. I don't want to bore everybody, but our colleagues were taking up a suggestion from Texas, whose legislature voted to endorse the Ten Commandments. And so I was in the Judiciary Committee, and Mike Johnson was there, now our Speaker of the House, and a bunch of them, and they said they wanted to endorse the Ten Commandments. And I said, gee, the Ten Commandments have been doing all right for the last couple of millennia without an endorsement of the U.S. House of Representatives. And they pressed the issue. We went to the Rules Committee. They wanted to expedite the whole thing. I said, well, if we're going to go to the floor of the House of Representatives to vote on the Ten Commandments, then we should have to vote on each commandment separately. Not get away with the omnibus package. You can't vote for any of the commandments you've ever violated yourself. Rather than taking the name of the Lord in vain, violating the third commandment. But it never ends. And in fact, Speaker Johnson has said that he places the Bible above the Constitution and above the country, and that's how he makes his decisions, which was shocking, especially on the day he made the decision to follow the dubious, spiritual pilgrimage to New York City to Donald Trump's trial, an adjudicated sexual assailant and fraudster, paying $130,000 in hush money to a porn star, and then covering it up. So, one reason the founders wanted to separate the church and state was to save the state from religious corruption, but the other reason was to save religion from political corruption and what politicians would do, essentially prostituting people's faith for political purposes. So, I think that, I've been crossing the country. I think people's fundamental belief in the separation of church and state is strong, and understand what a danger it is to merge the two, and how you end up with false prophets when you do that.
Interesting. And sort of turning a little bit towards the January 6th committee that you were so open on, and I think showed clearly how that was incited by the former president. And I was so impressed with your command of the evidence, your prosecution of the case. It really set, I think, the record straight, and you operated with a speed that really the Justice Department and the court process couldn't seem to muster. And so you're a constitutional law professor and a student of history. Throughout the select committee process, I know you reviewed so much data. I know many people here in this room have heard Liz Cheney speak when she came to Drew University to talk about her experiences. And I think, what I'm constantly thinking about when I think about January 6th, that was the first time we did not complete a peaceful transfer of power, something that in this country, I think many of us have been really proud of and thought we'd never seen as we've served in places around the world where that was always brought. And so were there places that you felt like our institutions were really held very well? I've been in different areas as we go through these tumultuous times, so impressed with our founding fathers and some of the things that they thought of, which maybe growing up I sort of didn't have a deep connection to, having not gone through a tumultuous time in our country. Were there institutions that you thought held up very well? And then are there areas you would like to see shored up as we move forward?
All right, well, thank you for this hour and 45 minutes to answer your question. Because there's really a lot to talk about there, but let me just take a couple points. One, and as I see our 16th president staring down on us in that beautiful portrait there, one of the things that I learned from this whole thing is how central the idea of insurrection actually has been in our history. And Lincoln made a speech about it in Congress right at the beginning of the war, and he said that insurrection is an assault on the very first principle of government, which is the right of the people to choose their own leaders. And I'll never forget, when we sat there at Mikie on the House that day, and the mob stormed the Capitol, and they were chanting, our house, or, whose house, our house, or whose Congress, our Congress. And in one sense, I completely agree with that. I mean, this is the people's government, it's the people's House and the people's Senate. But the way that you exercise power in the House is you elect your member to go there, and you come and lobby, and you can call people, but you don't show up with a mob of 1,000 people or 2,000 people and beat the daylights out of our officers, killing some of them, and overthrowing an election result. That's not democracy, that is insurrection. But now, I read the Constitution differently now, because I find at least 6 different places in our Constitution that explicitly counterpose constitutional democracy to insurrection. So check out, and I don't know who's got their Constitution with them, I forgot mine, but check out Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15, which says, Congress has the power to call forth the militias of the states in order to suppress insurrections, repel invasions, and enforce the law. All of that was because of Shays' Rebellion, something that took place right before the Constitution was written. If you read Alexander Hamilton, in the very first Federalist paper, he said that the main thing we had to worry about was demagogues, politicians who incite the mob to create violence against our institutions. He said they begin as demagogues and they end as tyrants. So they come in on the fury of the mob, as we saw on January 6th, but they end up just violating everybody's rights. It's very different from the idea of democratic rule of law. And ours is a constitution that is growing increasingly democratic since we started. If you read the constitutional amendments we've had since the Bill of Rights, those 17 amendments, the vast majority of them are democratizing amendments. They expand and diversify and include people in the constitutional experiment who were left out, right? The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment gives us equal protection and due process. The 15th Amendment bans race discrimination in voting. The 17th Amendment shifts the mode of electing U.S. senators from the legislatures to the people. The 19th Amendment doubles the franchise in America by passing women's suffrage. The 23rd Amendment gives people in D.C. the right to participate in presidential elections. The 24th Amendment bans poll taxes. 26th Amendment lowers the voting age to 18. The whole trajectory of our amendment has been towards including everybody. And then we've got all these anti-insurrectionary provisions in there. The Republican Guarantee Clause in Article 4 says that Congress shall guarantee to the people of the states a Republican form of government. That's a small r, Republican a representative form of government, right? And assist them in opposing domestic violence, right? The Treason Clause, the only place in the Constitution which defines a crime, defines it as levying arms against the Union or adhering to the enemies thereof. And so, this whole thing led me to completely rethink our fight about gun violence in America today, our debate about that. Because we've got more than 90% of the people who support a universal violent criminal background check for all gun purchase in America, close the gun show loophole, close the internet loophole. 80 or 90% of the people support bans on military-style assault weapons like AR-15. 90% of the people support red flag laws, and we can't move it. And I started to listen real carefully to our colleagues, Mikie, and what they say, because every time there's a massacre, our side would get up and say this is untenable, it's unsustainable, it's a violation of people's right to life, the fundamental right that's identified in the Declaration of Independence. And they'd say, well, there's nothing that can be done about it under the Second Amendment, right? The Second Amendment guarantees, they say, the right of the people to overthrow the government. So the people have to have an arsenal equal to that of the government. That's why we can't get rid of assault weapons. That's why we can't have a universal violent criminal background check. And just Matt Gaetz, Lauren Boebert, I was there when she said the Second Amendment doesn't protect the right of hunting unless you're talking about hunting tyrants, right? And Matt Gaetz says it gives the people the right to maintain the weapons they need to have an armed rebellion in the event the government turns tyrannical. And this is just chapter and verse now with our friends in the GOP. And I realize it cuts completely against what the Constitution says. We have all these anti-insurrectionary provisions. And they say the Second Amendment gives you the right to overthrow the government. Really, it says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And every time I talk about it, they say Raskin wants us to repeal the Second Amendment. No, I say we don't need to repeal the Second Amendment. We just need to read the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia, the Supreme Court has been very clear, means well-regulated by the state. Today, a well-regulated militia is the National Guard. But what's going on in our country, where we have 25 times the rate of gun violence of the countries in the European Union, and worse than that for Canada, for example, is the product of this complete distortion of the meaning of our Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution that gives, anybody the right to bring an assault weapon into a public school or a city hall or a library. And we have the right, even Justice Scalia said in Heller versus District of Columbia, to pass reasonable gun safety laws to protect the public welfare. So we've got to demolish this idea that somehow we've got a right to overthrow the government. And I'll give you just a final point on it. When I raised this with Chip Roy, who's their best constitutional scholar, or Matt Gaetz, or any of them, they say two things. One, they say, well, what about Patrick Henry? He said, give me liberty or give me death. Which certainly he did. It was a great bumper sticker in the 18th century, but it's not in the Constitution. And Patrick Henry was an anti-federalist who voted against the Constitution. So why would we turn to his rhetoric to interpret the meaning of our Constitution? It'd be like turning to Jefferson Davis to interpret the meaning of the 14th Amendment or something like that. Well, then they say, well, what about the revolution itself? What about the Declaration of Independence, right? When in the course of human events the government turns tyrannical, you've got a right to overthrow the government. That's right. Jefferson wrote that as a matter of natural law. He wasn't appealing to the British Constitution or the Magna Carta. He was saying that if a government is so tyrannical and violent towards you, then you appeal for, with a decent respect for the opinions of mankind, to other people around the world to say, support our struggle for freedom. So if you think that the election of 2020, for example, was an exercise in tyranny akin to British tyranny over the colonists, an election which Donald Trump's own Homeland Security chief said was the most secure and safest election in American history. If you think it was an exercise in tyranny, then go ahead. Come and try to beat up our officers, assault our Capitol Police, our Metropolitan Police, try to overthrow the peaceful transfer of power. But if through the courage and the valor of our officers we stop you, then we're going to prosecute you, we're going to jail you, and we're going to put you in prison for what you've done. Just like Stuart Rhodes, the Yale Law School graduate and the head of the Oath Keepers, who got sentenced to 18 years for seditious conspiracy, which means conspiracy to overthrow the government of the United States.
Right. you can see why Jamie Raskin is such an eloquent leader of our caucus, and so much of that happens just off the cuff on the floor of the House, which constantly has me really incredibly amazed. I think as we just have a few minutes, and we're going into another election, our first election since January 6th. And so, as we're thinking about it, you and I were with a group of people that started to think that, Donald Trump's suggestion that he wouldn't leave or wouldn't accept the election results was actually how he was feeling, and was considering staying in office despite what a Democratic election might show. And so we started to talk about the ways in which we completed a transfer of power, and what were the levers of that. And I don't know how you felt as we were having constitutional scholars in and weighing in on that, but I felt like there were very few. I felt like a lot of it really rested on tradition and a belief in our system of government, and it felt like there were very few levers we could use to force that transfer peacefully or ensure that it went forward. And so as you're looking forward to this January, where we will have our first transfer of power, possibly, or remain in power for President Biden, what are you thinking of that we need to be aware of, and where can we act to ensure that we have a peaceful election and a peaceful January in this country?
Well, Mikie, you're too modest, because Mikie Sherrill's been central in getting us all to focus on what are the changes and the reforms that we need in order to guarantee a peaceful transfer of power, something that we've taken for granted. By the way, January 6, 2021 was not the first time that trouble was forecast. When Lincoln came into office in 1861, there were a lot of street gangs and clubs, alas, some of them from Maryland, including one called the Rednecks, that's where that comes from, and the Pug Uglies, who went to Washington and were threatening to do something, and it was General Winfield Scott who said that anybody who dared to enter the Capitol to interfere with the peaceful transfer of power would be tied to a muzzle, and he would manure the lawns of Arlington, Virginia, where they remained. So nobody got in that day, and they were ready for them. And we can talk at some other point about why people did get in on January 6, 2021. But we've made some corrections. For example, the claim that the vice president can just unilaterally take the football and just run with it and decide who's going to be president, we've clarified that can't happen. We've also made it a lot more difficult to level objections to electoral college slates that have been sent to us in the form of certificates of ascertainment from the governors of the states. The truth, though, is that you can't adopt rules that are going to stop a tyrant or a despot, because that's someone who doesn't believe in rules. So a lot of it does depend on the courage and the strength of the people who are going to stand with us, and the willingness of leadership to go back in. I remember Mikie Sherrill very clearly saying, we've got to go back in, and we've got to count the votes, and we're not leaving here until we do that. And to his credit, Vice President Pence said the exact same thing. Remember, that to me, the 6 scariest words in the entire January 6th committee investigation came out when Pence was shepherded by Secret Service down into an undisclosed location in the basement somewhere, and they tried to get him in the car, and he said, "I'm not getting in that car." So I'm not getting in that car until the electoral college votes were counted. They said, "Well, we're here to take you where you need to go." And he's like, "Well, I don't know." He didn't know who was going to be controlling at that point his destination and where he was going to be. So we're going to have to make sure we are physically secure, that we are militarily secure with the transfer of power. But I believe really strongly, Mikie, having been all over the country now, that this is a nation that loves its democracy, that believes in democracy and the rule of law, and the people won't have it. We're not going to lapse into another form of government, and it's a real danger. People are right to be nervous about it. People are right to be in a high alert state. People are right to be vigilant and awake about it. I mean, we've got autocrats in Moscow, and we've got, I mean, all of them, Putin in Russia, and Orban in Hungary, and Marcos in the Philippines, El-Sisi in Egypt, Erdogan in Turkey, Xi in China, you name it. The dictators and the strongmen of the world are all rooting against democracy in America. But we've had elections before, and we know how to make elections work. And I guess my last point on that would be that, Tocqueville said in Democracy in America that democracy and voting rights in our country are either shrinking and shriveling away, or they're growing and expanding. And we got to get back on the growth track. The Supreme Court dismantled the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County versus Holder. We need to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We've got, we've got millions of people who are disenfranchised in our country. We've got 3.5 million American citizens in Puerto Rico who are not represented in the House or the Senate, can't vote for president. We get 713,000 tax-paying draftable citizens in the District of Columbia who are the only residents of the national capital on planet Earth who are not represented in their own legislature. And, when in the last Congress we passed DC statehood, and I got to be the floor leader for that, and I started by thanking the people of Washington who have a true, bona fide political grievance, but didn't come down and beat the daylights out of our officers and try to overthrow the government. They did it the right way. They petitioned for statehood, and we should act on that. John Dewey said that the only solution to the ills of democracy is more democracy. And what we suffer from today is not democracy, but the impediments and obstacles to it. The gerrymandering of our federal and state districts, voter suppression tactics, and also, I should say, the Electoral College I will defend it against anybody who would try to violently assault it or overthrow it, but we can use our constitutional mechanisms to get beyond the Electoral College. We should be electing the president, the whoever gets the most votes wins. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars exporting American democracy to all of these countries with new constitutions around the world. The one thing they never come back to us with is, that Electoral College thing? They don't import that to our country. So we can learn from the rest of the world. We can learn from our own experience. Let's just have an election for president. That'll work fine.
To talk about this, because this is really such a historical moment that you were really central to, and you're such an important figure, and to hear your comments and your thoughts on it, I'm a little bit of a fangirl, so I'm very honored.
I got a Jersey fangirl.
As well has joined us. So thank you all so much. This has been an amazing conversation. It's wonderful to see everyone here today thinking through how we go forward in this nation. As we know, New Jersey has always been so central to this, and we're going to get to talk a lot about that in the upcoming years, because our 250th anniversary, where George Washington spent more time than anywhere else during the Revolution. So we will be really, I think, exploring a lot of the things that you've been talking about. Hopefully we can make sure our children hear a lot about it too. But thank you all so much. I really do appreciate you coming out today. Thanks again.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead, sir. Thank you very much.
Let's see, we got a smudge. Got a smudge. Okay. Oh my God, so exciting. All right. Can we move that? Do you think? I think so. I think we all want to. Oh. We all want to get it. Okay. All right.